Well, hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Adam's Music Box. I almost forgot what the show is called. Isn't that funny? Well, today we're going to talk about how a trip to Tijuana changed music history. Now, Herb Alpert was a very precocious trumpet player and an early sort of musical maverick. He started his own record label with the intent, which he accomplished, of distributing his own records. It's a great way for not telling anyone what to do. But when he started this journey in 1962, he was lacking inspiration. So he went down to Tijuana and went to a bullfight. And the sounds, more than anything else, impressed him. The music, the crowd, the whole vibe and atmosphere. And so he decided to form a group of musicians to record music that was inspired by Mexico. And this was, of course, Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass, whose first album was The Lonely Bowl. I think it's El Solo Toro. If I'm correct, leave a comment below to see how badly that was. Now, the album was huge, all instrumental music inspired by the sounds of mariachi style Mexican music, and it became a pop hit in the in the US and elsewhere in the world. And this started a huge career for Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass throughout the 1960s, with albums like Whipped Cream and Other Delights, Tijuana Taxi, or Going Places, which featured the song Tijuana Taxi, Herb Alpert's Nine. There were so many. SRO stands for Standing Room Only. The list can go on, but each one sold really well. So much so that in 1966, Herb Alpert purchased a very historic film studio, the old Charlie Chaplin film studio on La Brea near Sunset in LA, and turned it into one of the most highly regarded music studios in the history of the world. He did well for himself. Now, several things are interesting about the kind of music that he was making in the 60s. And this is all about how the long journey of Latin or Latino music becoming mainstream pop in North America, north of Mexico, I should say. Now, prior to Herb Alpert in the 60s, there was, of course, always a Latin influence in the US charts, in the US music buying public's ears. But this was more from Cuba than from Mexico. Several reasons for this. The proximity of Cuba to the East Coast, which prior to the 50s and especially the 60s was the epicenter of the American music industry, and because a lot of the musicians would play in New York. And so Cuban jazz and other forms of Cuban influenced music were popular long before the 60s. And musicologists from around the world have always been very fascinated about Brazil's unique musical cultures. And for instance, Antonio Carlos Jobim, who got very popular, and he's just one of many. Yao Gilberto, who played a lot with Stan Getz. And so Brazilian music worked its way into the pop mainstream, or shall I say the jazz mainstream, both actually, independently of what Herb Alpert was doing. And then, of course, you had the success of a musical culture from south of the U.S. border, but which is Afro-Caribbean rather than Latin. And this was, of course, calypso, which was particularly popularized in the 50s by the late great Harry Belafonte. But Mexican music wasn't getting too much airplay on mainstream U.S. radio. Herb Alpert, though, took the themes of Mexican music. Some would say he appropriated it into pop. Some say he was creating pop fusion. But however you want to look at this interesting dynamic of interacting with other musical cultures, he made the music very popular, put it on the map, signed other bands like the Baja Marimba Band. And this, I think, played a great role in leading up to some of the great Latin fusion bands of the 70s. I'm thinking War, Mandrill, even Return to Forever, Chick Corea, very inspired by all sorts of Latin music, but audiences were ready for it, even at the more complex level that Chick Corea was offering it with because of the pop music, the instrumental pop music that Herb Alpert created in the 60s. And it stands the test of time. It's very listenable, it's very fun. It's the kind of music that will put a smile on your face, with or without the cool whip, as someone might say. Um, and not a lot of the instrumental pop of that era did stand the test of time. So there's a lot of credit to the production, the playing, and the composition of the music that Herb Alpert put out in the 60s. But his journey wasn't done there. In the early 70s, his own record sales started to go down, but A&M was just really hitting its stride in the 70s. The label never sought to sign loads and loads of artists. They were very selective. They only picked the stuff that Herb Alpert and Mr. Moss, I forget his first name, but he can forgive me, the A&M and A&M Records, say that 3 times fast. They wanted to form a personal musical relationship with the artists. And they signed great acts. Cat Stevens, Joe Cocker. They brought Procol Harum to America. Humble Pie, Nazareth, Jeffrey Osborne, the great Brenda Russell. Jeffrey Osborne's great as well. I think I said Nazareth. I think I may have said Supertramp. I don't know if I said Peter Frampton, but the list is so wide. And there's actually a really great story that I've got about Gino Vanelli, who got signed to A&M. So Gino was with his brother in LA from Canada trying to make it big. And he stood outside of A&M Records waiting and waiting to see Herb Alpert. And then he saw him walk across from the studio to his car, and he rushed in to see him. The security guard luckily didn't shoot him, thinking he was some sort of maniac. But he runs up to Herb Alpert, who's totally confused by the whole thing, and hands him a demo tape and says, "Please, Mr. Alpert, listen to this. I think you'll like it." And what did he do? He signed Gino Vanelli, who created some of the best vocally driven fusion music of the 70s and 80s. Another great move by Herb Alpert. So they really didn't sign anyone bad. They signed the Police, and later on they released Sting's music, Styx, the Tubes, so many people. Krista Berg, who had a lot of hits on both sides of the Atlantic in the 80s. The Brothers Johnson, great funk band. Atlantic Star, excellent 80s R&B. Oingo Boingo, the list goes on. They were huge in terms of the new wave movement. So he also left a legacy beyond that, because even though his own record sales went down in the early 70s, in the late 70s, he had a surprise hit with the sort of funk and R&B instrumental album Rise, whose title track became sampled by many hip-hop artists, most famously the Notorious B.I.G., for the song Hypnotize in 1996. So go figure. The legacy lives on, and he still owns a jazz club in LA, and he's apparently still there, even though he's quite old these days. So if you haven't heard Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass, do check them out. You're not going to be disappointed. Like, subscribe. We will see you next time. Bye-bye. Take care.